But first, a little more about the difference between big history and, let's say, traditional history. Traditional history is about big events, about wars, about kings, queens, all these discoveries, all these things is very different from, let's say, the scheme of cosmic evolution. But interestingly, if you just go back a few centuries, in fact, no more than 1.5 centuries, that difference did not yet exist in our societies, both on this side of the Atlantic and in Europe. And that may surprise you, but that's the case. For example, here's an example. It's a Dutch example. It's a history of the world written by a Dutchman, but probably copied from German and English sources, because there are plenty English, German, French, and probably also other languages of these similar histories. And what these histories consist of is they start with the biblical account of creation, and then, of course, through the big flood, and then down to what happened in Mesopotamia, and then basically they start to sort of put in all the history that they knew, that they had acquired up to their present day. So in a sense, it was a big history. It was not an academic big history, because the first part was based on a religious tradition, but it did answer all the big questions. All the big origin questions are here and are being discussed. And this is a tradition that actually goes back a long time, deep into the Middle Ages, perhaps as far back as the late Roman Empire. You can find examples of this type of history. So, in a sense, big history is not really new, it is actually rather old. If you are willing to consider this some kind of an incipient big history. Now, as an aside, how did I become aware of this book? Well, the reason is very simple. My granddad, here you see him, used to collect big histories. And I inherited some of them. So that's how I found out about this type of history. And then I started to explore that, and I found many others. And then I started to collect big histories in the United States, actually, during my visits here. And here you see an example of such a book that was published in 1837. It was Peter Parley's Universal History. That was a series of books written, let's say, under the name of Peter Parley, who was a fictional personality, and there were all kinds of ghost writers who would write their part. So this was about history, but were all Peter Parley stories. And this particular history was written by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And it's basically the same structure. Starts with the biblical account, goes all the way to the present day. And then what you see is around 1850, things start to change. Here you see an example of when things start to change. This is a book, a similar kind of work, written by this school teacher, Joseph Worcester, from Massachusetts. And it was also some kind of an all-encompassing history. This was required reading for freshmen at Harvard at the time. So in that sense, Harvard was then doing big history. No longer, but then it was. But what you see in this book, and that is very interesting, that doubts are creeping in. And the reason is that the modern science of geology, which has brought to light a vast number of important and interesting facts previously unknown, has produced a conviction among men of science that the origin of the Earth is to be ascribed to a period far more remote than has been heretofore supposed. And the most learned Christian divines have adopted a mode of interpreting the Mosaic account of the creation, which is in accordance with this opinion. He didn't explain how he did that. But what you see is that they're taking distance from it. They're saying, oh no, it is different. We have to admit that the Earth has existed for a much longer time. So there you see something very interesting happening, that people taking distance from the traditional account without being able to actually provide a new account. What is happening actually is that around that time, the modern historical profession is emerging, and that goes hand in hand with the emergence of nation states. Nation states like the United States or France or Britain or Germany, or in Central and South America, all these countries, they all want to write their own history, hopefully a good, proud history, so that people can feel good about their own country, that you create good citizens, right? That is the idea. And therefore, these historians get established at all universities, and usually let's say the professor who teaches their own history is the most important person in that department. So what you're teaching and what you're trying to create is a story of the origins of your own state, and you place it into a wider context of how it got there, and that's usually the Western civ trajectory, which was formulated around that time. So that is the kind of history that you get, and there's a great emphasis on literary sources, and get rid of the biblical account. That doesn't count anymore. So what you get is a history that goes back to about 5,000 years ago, and all the rest doesn't matter anymore. And that has become the established history. And that is something very different from big history, of course. But the result was that, in fact, almost all the big origins questions disappeared. They were gone, and nobody was paying attention to them anymore, because there was no credible academic account for it. Yet, at the same time, people were thinking about how can we do that, but even a radical like Darwin, right, was very skeptical. He said it's merely rubbish to think at present of the origin of life. One might as well think of the origin of matter. Well, that's what we're doing right now in big history. But at that time, that was considered complete nonsense by him. Yet, at the same time, scientific discoveries continued, and that changed our view, and that made it possible to create a modern big history.